and welcome to Hospice Insights, the Law and Beyond, where we connect you to what matters in the ever-changing world of hospice and palliative care.
Hospital to hospice, managing referrals and relationships. Brian, this is an exciting episode because it is a listener request. So here we are. We got an email from a listener who was in, quote, "I'm a big fan of your Hospice Insights podcast," and then proceeded to ask us to speak about GIP eligibility at the end of hospital stays and what does that look like and where are the lines and stuff. So here we are today talking about this listener question. So
yeah, it's great to get feedback from listeners, and we do take requests. So yeah, happy to address the topics that are on folks' minds. So, and this is an interesting one.
Yeah, so it sounds like requests. I feel like we're on Casey Kasem or something, like doing our own, like, what was that? Came out, it was on the weekends with Casey Kasem.
The American Top 40. Yeah, we're spinning the hits.
Yeah, spinning the hits. So I think we're showing our age there. It's only like Gen X and greater that know that reference probably.
Yeah, who took over for Dick Clark and that? He's the younger guy. Ryan Seacrest.
Yeah,
for the younger
he's
folks.
probably now our age, but he did seem younger at the time. So, so anyway, we're rolling the hits here. Taking special requests and dedications. Yes, that's what I'm thinking.
It's a long distance dedication.
Yeah, exactly. Long distance dedication to our listeners here. But so, and I guess when I read this question, Brian, a couple things that struck me, and we'll break down each of them. But one is just, let's take a look at what the government has actually said about what qualifies for GIP, because I think this is actually an area where there's some very helpful and very specific guidance. And I want to make sure that hospices are not being too conservative, or because I think there's been audit activity in this space and people getting very nervous and very conservative sometimes, and maybe too much so. Because, and obviously, Brian, you can speak to your audit experience because we've taken a lot of cases to ALJ involving GIP, including one that was like many millions of dollars, and we won, all of those. So let's break down what the government actually says qualifies for GIP, and then two, I think talking about these questions often come up because there's late referrals to hospice. And so how can we work with our hospital partners to say, can we work together to, get patients at the right time? Because a lot of patients, as we know, do want to be able to die at home if at all possible, or at a minimum, not die in the hospital setting. And so how do we essentially deal with this more on the front end so we're not getting late referrals? What I don't want to get into a ton, but it's a question that comes up a lot. It's just, I think, too nuanced for a podcast, is just, when do you do the routine home care level of care in the hospital? I mean, those should be rare instances that we're doing that, not like a, regular thing. But I've come to glean over the last 10 years that those issues have been coming up more. And so if you do have those issues, that's more of we need to talk offline about those. So just as a disclaimer, we're not going to get into that area, but let's kick it off, Brian, first with, what does the government actually say about what the standard is for GIP eligibility? Because it has some very specific things of when it might be appropriate that are relevant to this question.
CMS, the standard is pretty generally stated, and I think CMS has made some comments in its manuals that may come as a surprise to some providers in the breadth of GIP. And GIP is one of those. It's a level of care where CMS they audit folks who provide GIP for more than 6 days. They criticize hospices for not providing enough GIP.
Yeah,
It's easy to get caught in the middle of really what should the hospice be emphasizing. But I think the place to start really is what are the requirements? GIP is inpatient stay for pain control or acute or chronic symptom management that cannot feasibly be provided in other settings. So kind of fill in that in working with your physician about how do you demonstrate that. And CMS has given a couple of examples that I think are pretty helpful, including one that relates to this topic we're talking about, this hospital to hospice issue. So if you go to the benefit policy manual, CMS has given an example of what could be an appropriate GIP stay. And what they say is that a brief period of general inpatient care may be needed in some cases when a patient elects the hospice benefit at the end of a covered hospital stay. And so in advocating these cases, if we have a patient who has come off of a hospital stay, admitted to the hospice for GIP, and for some reason that claim was denied, we're pointing that out to the decision makers in the appeal process. Is this falls right into what CMS has identified as kind of a classic example of the appropriateness for GIP. And the documentation should reflect that. I mean, it's going to be clear from the documentation that this patient was in the hospital and then went into GIP at the hospice, but draw those connections in the documentation yourself. So talk to your physicians, nurses, clinicians about drawing that connection between the covered hospital stay and getting on to GIP. That's very helpful, very persuasive when we can point to CMS's own manual as supporting our position. And another element or example
Brian, maybe
yeah.
just to pause there, it sounds like judges in the cases that you've had, that is helpful. I mean, because we've won a lot of GIP cases, and I think when we're evaluating the relative strength of GIP, obviously the devil's in the documentation, but in terms of just from a pure data perspective, it's like, are they coming out of a hospital stay? Because again, that's the acknowledged scenario where it might be something that's needed. Because they specifically say, too, in the manual that it's not equivalent to a hospital level of care. So the fact they're not going to be in the hospital anymore doesn't mean then they don't qualify for GIP because they're not qualifying for the hospital level of care anymore. It's sort of a different kind of thing. And there can also, I mean, sometimes folks are actively dying I'm not saying every actively dying person needs GIP. I don't want anyone on this podcast to think that we are saying that, but there can be a lot of changes that are going on at that period of time. And I think the kind of pain medications people might have been getting in the hospital could be different than the things we might be doing. And so there's a lot of med adjustment that might need to be happening as they're transitioning to our care and things like that. So when we, back to what you read in the benefit policy manual is, for pain control or acute symptom management. And it was and I know we're getting here, but other examples are the need for medication adjustment. So I know when we're advocating for GIP cases, I also look at how many med adjustments did we need to make every single day. We're titrating medications. We're, doing a lot of potentially PRNs because we're trying to understand what's the right amount before we move to scheduling something. And so medication adjustment is another thing. And then observation. holy cats, Brian, observation, that's, as you said, very broad, too. And again, I don't think, Brian, we're advocating like everyone coming out of the hospital needs to be on GIP for observation. I mean, that's not what we're
Yeah.
talking about, but, we're going to the benefit policy manual. And Brian, we should maybe post this in the episode notes so people can have this as a reference point, because it is good to read CMS's own words on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And that observation note, when CMS says, if a patient is in need of medication adjustment, observation, or other stabilizing treatment, again, that's CMS's words, and we like to argue that we are providing exactly the kind of care that CMS is expecting will be provided at GIP. And for observation, we try to frame it as skilled assessments. What kind of assessment is being provided for that patient that could not be provided in another setting? Because that's that final critical element that ALJs often ask about. At the end of testimony from an expert, they'll say, well, why couldn't all of this have been done in a different setting? And so we want to be able to say, well, it was only in GIP where there was ready, frequent, immediate access to nurses who are trained in how to assess patients clinically and determine what additional interventions may be needed. Even if no interventions are ultimately provided, or if no interventions are kind of provided with a degree of frequency that suggests, it's equivalent to hospital inpatient care, which, as you said, it's not. But as long as we can make the argument that this patient needed to be assessed in a professional way to determine if they're, have they reached a level of stabilization? Is it a kind of stabilization that is going to endure, or would it be irresponsible to discharge a patient quickly upon the first whiff of potential stabilization without allowing them, the opportunity to make sure that it's going to endure? They're in the clear. They can then go home and ideally have a peaceful death in the home.
Yeah. Well, and two, we focus so much on the pure sort of nursing aspect of this, but importantly too, the benefit policy manual talks about, when they say stabilizing treatment, such as psychosocial monitoring. That's important because, again, we've like medicalized hospice so much in the role of the physician and the face to face. I mean, it just, hey, there's a psychosocial aspect of what's going on here too that is important. So again, this is probably an overstatement, but I'm feeling dramatic today. This is one of the most helpful and very specific examples and guidance the government has given in areas that um, you know they can be very obtuse in other ways, and so there's room here in terms of interpretation, and I think our audit experience says that it's not like these things are living in practice. Like following this gives you a very good defense on the audit side.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. But what is important is in order to take advantage of what CMS has done here with some of these broad statements, is make sure your medical records reflect that.
Oh,
It's
absolutely.
it's harder to go back in time at an ALJ hearing and say, well, these were skilled assessments and this is what they were looking for. Better to document in real time what value and expertise is the nurse bringing to the situation when they're doing an assessment, a skilled assessment. Is it psychosocial monitoring? Get specific in your documents so that you can later on connect the dots. Because ALJs are going to expect you to have a record. They're gonna expect interventions, like you said. If you don't do anything with a patient, you're with in terms of interventions, that's going to be a tough case to make. But recognizing interventions can be, medications, it can be observations, it can be other sorts of interventions that you need to document in order to take advantage of them and fall within what CMS is saying.
Well, and I think critical to that is this question embeds in it that we're doing GIP in the hospital, right? Is that you can't just rely on the hospital's documentation to support your level of care, right? Like you're contracting with them for that level of care, assuming the person qualifies. And their documentation is going to be very important, right? But the layer of documentation of our nurses, our social workers because they're going to be more attuned to the GIP level of care. And I think embedded in this question is the hospice needs to be making this determination of level of care. And that's a push-pull that I think hospitals may say, well, they qualify for GIP, and we might be saying, well, that's our determination, not yours. That can be a frustrating aspect of this. So I think really critical that our nurses, and this is why ideally, that you don't have to pass on 100% of your per diem to the hospital for GIP. I know in some areas you can't get a contract with the hospital for something less than 100% of the per diem, but because you're still going to have to do stuff when someone's on GIP, right? You're still sending your nurses, your social workers, things like that. And so that documentation, I think that's so critical that you're talking about, Brian, is going to be a combination of both what the contracted hospital is documenting, but also what your staff is writing, because they're going to be more tuned to this level of care and the standards for documentation. Um, but yeah, I think again, medication adjustment, observation, and other stabilizing treatments such as psychosocial monitoring. So, um, I always like to distill things down to, how many med adjustments are you making? And um, both in the type of medication, but also dosages. And I already said the PRN thing, but I think that that's important too, because when we're just getting involved with the patient, that's going to be more apt. What we're using is PRNs till we can figure out, what's the um, right dosage to make sure that this pain is really controlled and we're not over medicating or under medicating and all that.
Yeah, it takes a lot of, from what I understand, talking with a number of physicians as we kind of go through these cases, there is a lot of tinkering with the medication, and trial and error to find the right mix that's going to get that patient where they need to be to get off of GIP. And that importance of documentation also goes with that final element I mentioned before, that the care cannot feasibly be provided in another setting. A lot of times that is a piece of information that is not really explicit in the documentation. But as I said, the ALJs are always asking that question. It would be an easier argument for hospices to make later on if they documented, well, why couldn't we have done this in another setting? And then we're not trying to develop that answer for the first time in an audit appeal, but it's in the documentation itself and becomes a much more reliable, credible piece of information to get you through these appeals. And maybe you wouldn't even get denied in the first place if that was more clear.
Yeah. And so I guess on the second broad point is working with hospitals, like, are we getting patients at the right time in their care? And I think palliative care is an important bridge. And so many hospitals have their own palliative care service. If they don't, we've worked on partnerships where hospices um, through, a separate business line or whatever, maybe supporting or helping manage a palliative care program in the hospital. But I think as a bridge here, having that really important goals of care conversation with family members, like, is that happening at the right time, or is that happening really because no one wants to have the conversation when it's so late in the game? And so I think that that's part of these conversations too. Are we getting patients at the right time? And I do think um, through personal experience, I used to think like, oh, if we can only provide a day of hospice care, like, because hospitals will say, oh, I give you the referral because then they can get, their 13 months of bereavement and all this stuff. And like, well, how much can we do in 24 hours? And I do think hospice can do a ton in 24 hours as a person who's experienced the gift of that. But it's not always ideal, right? And so I do think we can do a lot, but we can do even more when we have 48 hours and 72 hours and all that. So
Yeah, and I think that's where, if tensions arise between the hospital hospice relationship, it's usually when there's a rush to accomplish certain things, or everybody has their competing interests and they're trying to accomplish that in a relatively short amount of time. The hospice wants to transition care to a hospice. The hospice certainly wants to get in there and provide the care. The patient wants to die, have a good death, comfortable setting, probably not in a hospital, definitely not in a hospital, but at home. And so what you're saying, Meg, about earlier access and information about hospice is a way to relieve a lot of that last minute tension that can arise in that relationship. And it's having that kind of communication and discussion with the hospital about how do we stretch out so we're not kind of in a last minute rush all the time and frustrating people's expectations. How do we move that back a number of days so that it's just an easier transition? And maybe if the hospital kind of has a better understanding of the hospice's role and responsibilities, you can all get on the same page, and that's going to benefit the patient overall. And you're not going to have those kinds of tensions arise when it's a last minute situation.
so easier said than done.
Oh,
So
yeah.
we're not here to be like Pollyanna, like, oh, just do this. It's so easy, right?
Hey,
But
just pick up the phone and solve all the problems.
yeah,
It's
well,
what's
because
the big
as
deal?
you say, there's a lot of competing interests
Yeah.
here. And, you have a hospital that has, how many physicians practicing it that all handle things in a different way and all that. So it is a challenging issue, but I guess the takeaway is let's go back to basics and dust off like what has the government said about this, and are we documenting to this standard? Because this is the standard, and because I think um, you know this is, I guess, my personal commentary here. Something I don't like to see about these audits is that people feel like, oh, I'm practicing medicine in a way based on audits. and and it's like what you hear from other people and stuff, because our big thing when we talk about audits is what you hear is the beginning of the story, not the end of the story. And that's why we like to share success stories, because I think it gives some perspective that all is not lost. So if you essentially, you know, practice medicine or practice hospice in a way like I will never get audited, right? First of all, I think that's completely, impossible in this day and age right now. But two, just because a claim gets denied does not mean that you did something wrong. And that's why there's appeals. And that's why, still 70, 80% of claims that we appeal, we win. And so I don't want us to be so scared that we're not doing the benefit, right? And good hospices should, I mean, you're following the law and you're following the guidance, and that should mean something. And so you shouldn't bury your head in the sand, but you also shouldn't be afraid to do what the benefit allows for, right? It's like, you're right. People, when you look at the data, I mean, I've never worked with a hospice that had a GIP cap problem, right? Even though
Yeah.
the cap is written that, there's the second cap for GIP. No one's hitting that. And frankly, when you look at most of the data, there isn't a lot of GIP that's being provided. I know that it's getting audited because it's a high dollar amount and they recently increased the rates, but um, it is it is a really important level of care. Um, I'm glad people are being mindful, listeners are being mindful of audit activity in this space. Um, I think I just want to remind people of, hey, let's actually look at
Yeah.
what the government said about this. And, if you do think this person is eligible under the guidance, like, you should provide that care and you should look at it daily, right? Too. This
Sure.
isn't, I think that's another challenge is, are you really documenting eligibility for GIP on a daily basis as opposed to just, oh, okay, they're eligible and then we'll look at it again in a week or so or whatever.
That's certainly the expectation is daily, but also just on the clinical side, as you mentioned, Meg, there's a lot of resources for making clinical judgments, and audit results is not the best resource to guide your medical practice. You can go to refer to board certified hospice physicians, other medical literature relating to hospice and GIP, whatever is clinically sound, and make sure your physicians are up to speed on the medicine around general inpatient care and acute or pain control and acute symptom management. That's, I think, the primary resource. I always tell our clients when they get their audit results, take it with a big grain of salt because there is an appeal process, and the reviewers in these audits, they're not necessarily focused solely on clinical issues. So you shouldn't kind of have your practice of medicine dictated by particular audit results in a single audit, but look at the bigger picture. And persistence and patience pays off in these audit appeals, where ultimately, in most cases, good medicine wins out.
Yeah. And I think that to that point, making sure that your physician is very involved in terms of documentation of eligibility for this level of care, not just the nurse, right? I mean, people get an order from a physician for level of care changes. It's very common practice and best practice, but also that's not a one and done. I think keeping your hospice physician engaged. I mean, you're probably going to be having a physician evaluating this patient clinically, examining them every day, but also making sure that the physician is being very mindful of that definition. And I think it's great when we can have physicians um, be documenting to this on a real time basis their level of care because nurses can be documenting about the symptoms and the medication adjustment needed, but a physician can really be a dot connector to why this level of care is needed, and as he said, on a real time basis. So, all right, well, we don't have any magic. I think it was just a great question, a hard question, but something I thought that we should address because our listener asked us to, but also that there are some helpful things to remind people from the CMS guidance, and it's not in um, the the state operations manual. It's actually in the benefit policy manual um, that we're talking about this. So maybe everyone knows about this, but it's always a good reminder to folks, because I think we get so focused on what the cops have to say. And yes, that's important, but there's other manuals, and this is really important information. So we will post this. And again, thank you to our listener for the question. And please always send questions or feedback or ideas, or, hey, we really enjoy it, because Brian and I put a lot of time into the podcast. So hearing that you find it valuable means a lot to us. So, and you can always review us on, Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast, and give us, a great rating, because it does help other people find us. So thank you.
Thanks, Meg.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Hospice Insights, The Law and Beyond. Thank you for joining the conversation. To subscribe to our podcast, visit our website at hushblackwell.com or sign up wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, may the wind be at your back.